the legislators, as we call them in some jurisdiction in Nigeria, what you call the MPs, members of parliament who are retired, wants to collect a monthly retirement fund money of 100,000 Kenyan shillings from the government. But Mr. President Uhuru Kenyatta says, no. If you have served as a legislator and you have retired, you are not entitled to collect 100,000 shillings every month as an ex-legislator. Case closed. Meantime, there was a big conference today, of course, virtually by PathTrack. The idea was to discuss issues around the race for WTO. You have a couple of African contenders, including Nigeria's two-time finance minister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. So the idea is that what do we really want as Africa if we eventually have an African as the Director General for the World Trade Organization? So the idea was to bring everybody together, policymakers, business leaders from Nigeria, all over the continent, to talk about the expectations and priorities that we want. It's not enough to canvass, to hold the position of a Director General for the WTO. But what exactly does Africa want? What do we want? And we need to put all that together quickly before the decision is made. Who becomes the next head of this important World Trade Organization? Meantime, Orange of France is interested in Ethiopia's telecommunications privatization program, but the Ethiopian says that's not going to happen until February next year. Remember the story? The authorities in Addis Ababa wants to reserve 5% of the Ethio Telecom privatization shares for the citizens. How that will work out, we will see between now and February next year. Meantime, Airtel Tanzania is saying thank you to all the Tanzanians who use the company's mobile money app and services, and the way to say thank you is to give them 3.6 billion Tanzania shillings dividend for the mobile money services that they used. How that will be shared out, if you're a customer in Tanzania, I'm sure you'll be happy to get a bit of that. Finally, Rwanda inflation figure for August slowed from 9.2%, you can see that at the bottom there, to 8.8%. And the reason is simple. The food inflation also went down to 11.1%. Despite the hard lockdown in Rwanda, inflation came down from 9.2 to 8.8, and food inflation. You'll see a similar story in Egypt, by the way, when we get there. For now, let's go to Kenya, where unlike their Nigerian counterparts, the banks there are waiting for the guidance from the country's central bank on whether they are able to pay dividend this year or not. This was as the bank in the East African country posted decent earnings in the first half of the year, despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant economic lockdown. George BODO is a director at CALLSTREET Research and Analytics in Nairobi, and he knows the banking industry like the back of his hand. Good evening, my friend. It's good to see you.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm doing fine today in Lagos. Any word yet from Central Bank Governor Njoroge on whether Kenyan banks are allowed to pay dividend for the year 2020?
Well, it's not really. I don't know. It's made a lot of news. The thing is that Central Bank issued a guidance about 3 years ago that every year banks have to prepare a certain document, which they're calling it ICAP, which is the Internal Capital Adequacy Assessment paper. And they have to submit to Central Bank. And in that paper, banks have to outline a number of things, including projecting the amount of dividend they plan to pay. And the Central Bank has to basically approve this document. And if they don't approve it, basically they have to issue no objection. And if they issue an objection, that means you can't implement a number of things that is outlined in that document, including pay dividends. So they have the right to give no objection to certain line items. You say we're going to do this, we're going to reduce our risk-weighted assets, we're going to pay our dividends, our shareholders' dividends this much. So they have to basically issue no objection to every line item. Well, they're just trying to reinforce it now. But what I'm trying to say is that this is something that has been there, and paying dividend is part of the document. So,
But COVID-19 is a particularly different situation. It's a different kettle of fish.
yeah, it's a different situation, and basically, I think now central bank would be looking at these line items with a tooth of a comb and saying, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" I think they're now going to start asking staff questions. Why are you paying dividend at this point in time? We don't think you should pay dividend. We don't think you should do this. So I think we don't see anything that is likely to gobble capital. I think they're likely to say no, including I think they're likely to decline Kenyan banks capitalizing their regional associates, regional brands. I think they're likely to say no for that. I think I've seen that across, even including Nigeria, CBN basically raising tough questions on a number of banks funding their affiliates. So I think they're likely to say, I've seen, apart from dividends, I see them also asking tough questions, issuing objections to regional banks funding their regional businesses.
So, George, are the banks' earnings good enough? Equity capital, I&M, cooperative, and all the other names, as it were, KCB, are the earnings and the capital base well enough to afford dividend payments, Standard Chartered, Standard Holdings, and the rest?
No, I don't think so. And by the way, when we just talk about the Q2 performance, overall Q2 profit after tax was down by half for the entire sector, and impairment losses were up 80%. And you can see the impact of COVID-19, especially in Q2, on impairment adjustments for a number of the banks. And the worst affected for me were the tier one banks. There are about 7 of them today. Their earnings were also down half. I saw the impairment adjustments were almost close to 100%. This is quarter on quarter, by the way. We're not even talking year on year. This is quarter on quarter. A number of, by the way, including a bank like ABSA, posted a quarterly loss of 25 cents per share. KCB, the largest balance sheet in the region, so its earnings down 70% year on year. Equity Bank earnings were down almost by a third quarter on quarter. So you could see that, and I guess for the tier one banks, the results were more, they bore the brunt of this pandemic, largely because they have a very big portfolio compared to the other banks. There are tier two banks, their earnings were largely stable. I didn't see much movement in payment adjustment. But I mean, for me, that's, and even the tier three banks, there was no much movement in terms of payment adjustment. But it raises a big question for me that I am still struggling to reconcile some of those numbers with the risk environment at the time. I think that I'm almost tempted to suggest that management judgment for some of those banks, including a bank like Cooperative Bank, which reported strong Q2 earnings. I'm tempted to question judgment by management and how they see their customers performing through to Q3, even into Q4. I think that for the banks that reported losses, and I mentioned ABSA, I think that was a fair reflection of the risk environment. But the rest, for a number of them, I struggle to reconcile the numbers with the risk environment at that time.
George, quick one. But there is so much liquidity in the Kenyan banking system. So are the banks aggressively lending into the business sectors, especially the SMEs, because they talk about impairments? That means they must be giving credit. The loan book must be expanding.
They have liquidity, yes, you're right. They're sitting on piles of liquidity, but the liquidity is being used to buy treasury bills and treasury bonds. If you look at the net movement in that portfolio compared to loan movements, you can see loan movements have been very material. I think on a year-on-year basis, an annual growth momentum of private sector credit is still around 6 to 7%, which is still very, very soft compared to 5 years ago. We were doing 20%, 25%. So you can see the impact of COVID, and even I think it's not really COVID, by the way. I mean, you could see there was a downdraft in private sector credit growth, even as far as last year. But of course, you could say that for about 3 years, we've been operating on a tightly controlled pricing environment. We had price controls for 3 years. That also contributed. But also you can see that COVID has also exacerbated the situation. So I don't actually see loan books growing significantly. I think I will still see private sector credit growing by single-digit territory even in the second half of the year. But I don't see much. So you're likely to see some banks buying more treasury bills, treasury bonds, which is what you call lazy banking.
So how are the commercial banks listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange performing at the moment? We saw some good numbers today. Has it always been like that? Is that a vote of confidence by investors?
Oh, don't be fooled by today, by the way. You need to look at the stretch that graph.
Okay.
Banks have lost 20% of since the year began. I think bank stock prices are down 20%. In terms of market capitalization, all the listed banks have lost about $2.5 billion of market cap the first half of the year. That's very significant. Kenyan banks are trading at par with the book value. About 4 years ago, they were trading at almost 1.5, 1.6 in average terms. Now they're trading at par. But obviously, that's still a premium compared to Nigerian banks, which are probably, a number of them are trading below book value. Yeah, so don't be fooled by today, but in actual sense, banks have really underperformed.
Okay. A final one, my friend. Let's say congratulations to Equity Bank CEO James Mwangi, who's been awarded the Oslo's Peace Prize for Business. How significant is this for him and Equity Bank and indeed for Kenya? I know he's a man who is loved as a banker in Kenya.
Yeah, I think that's good for the brand. It's good for his own brand. It's good for the Equity Bank's brand visibility. But I think also, it's fair to say that James Mwangi disrupted banking sector in Kenya. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, opening a bank account was such an Herculean task, You need to prove that you can actually sustain that bank account. You need to bring so many letters to, even including utility bills. Banks were really feeling sweet, opening a bank account. But when James Mwangi came and said, you don't need all those things, just come, you walk out of the bank account. And that changed the bank.
So that's the man who democratized it.
Yeah, he democratized banking in Kenya. And then also, he came and said, okay, third-party platforms, he pioneered third-party platforms. You don't need to go to the branch. You could go to the agent. You can go to the nearest shopkeeper. I think he deserves a lot of credit in the way he's transformed the bank. And the other banks followed suit. They had to pave in name, pave in.
You just remind me of a Nigerian banker who was also very young and savvy like that by the name Tony Elumelu. I'm sure you know him with the UBA. But that's a story for another day. He was also one of the guys who believed that, look, just democratize the whole thing, just get the banking done, break down the motors and get it done. Thank you, George. Have a pleasant evening in Nairobi.